Hi, I'm Jesse Mangan.
And I'm Rob Wipond, and this is a special edition of PsychForce.Report TV, where we're going to do a news roundup of all the big stories from November of 2024 to March of 2025. We got a lot to cover. Jesse, are you ready?
Yeah, let's do this rapid fire edition. Let's go. So in November of 2024, the Department of Justice, their Civil Rights Division for United States, launched an investigation into psychiatric facilities in Michigan for the claim or the allegation that they are holding people beyond the point which they're clinically cleared for discharge. So you're in a hospital, you're in a psychiatric facility. Someone says you no longer need to be here. The facility holds you for days, months, years beyond that. So the Department of Justice had launched that investigation.
Yeah, and this is really resonant for us, right? In one of our previous conversations, we were looking at multiple large facilities engaged in these kinds of, if there's profiteering involved, people will call it fraud. When
Mhm.
there isn't profiteering involved, what's the name for it? And yet it's often the same practice. And in my book, I talked about how the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ was prosecuting cases like this really around the country in like 15 or 20 states at the time, as I recall, where tens of thousands of people were being held unnecessarily in psychiatric institutions. Even sometimes when the psychiatrists themselves were saying, we want to get these people out of here. So sometimes, not always, it would be linked to that this might be a homeless person who had nowhere
Mhm.
else to go. And so they thought, well, this person's going to degenerate, so we'll keep them here. But that's illegal to do that. And then in other cases, it wasn't that. It was just, well, we think they're better off here. So we have all these different reasons going on, and it's really a widespread problem. But you have other concerns about this case too, don't you?
Well, I have serious questions about whether the Department of Justice will follow through with this investigation, given that it was opened in November of 2024 before the election. The state of the Department of Justice in the United States right now is just very suspect. And so I don't know what their priorities are. I would have more faith if the investigation was being done by a state organization. So in New Jersey last year, a similar thing has happened in New Jersey where there is a New Jersey state law which allows holding someone past the point where they're clinically cleared. Well, technically, a judge clears the person and the clinicians say, we don't want to do that. And then they could just kind of hold the person longer. And so the state says it is legal for us to continue to hold someone because we don't like where they're going. And so a state protection and advocacy organization in New Jersey has challenged that. I have more faith that that might go somewhere because that's within the state as opposed to the Department of Justice, which is a mess right now.
Right, it is. And we can also be worrying about, I think, the funding for that state organization, some of
Mhm.
which is coming federally too. So yeah, let's make sure we monitor this and return later to see if in fact this case even goes through.
Yeah.
The Arizona Center for Investigative Reporting described how, quote, white vans were appearing on reservations and people with addiction were disappearing. Subsequent investigations found that some $2.5 billion in fraud was happening at these abusive sober homes where at least 40 Arizona indigenous people died. This was going on for years. There's been a lot of coverage around it. It's really, really abusive and scary. And it's similar in some ways, I want to highlight, to a New York Times investigation finding that, again, we're seeing fraud happening at a whole range of addiction treatment clinics that are run by Acadia Healthcare, seeming fraud, I'll say. And then another interesting and in my mind related case in New Jersey showing that they called it New Jersey's worst nursing home. And in this case, they found that tens of millions of dollars were being made off of largely destitute nursing home residents. And that's the theme I want to highlight here. We have all of these cases where in most of the patients being treated, most of the people being treated were actually not well-to-do people. So we have cases where enormous amounts of money, billions in the case of the Arizona investigation of the abuse of indigenous people, billions of dollars being made off of largely destitute people. And that's something everyone needs to know about involuntary commitment, is that there's a lot of way to make enormous amounts of money off of people in it. Do you have anything to add to this case, Jesse?
I mean, particularly with the instances in Arizona, there's just a long legacy of targeting Indigenous people, First Nations for with these type of laws. Conservatorships were used to take Indigenous land, to steal Indigenous land. Like I think the Osage people had particularly gross instances of that in the I think 1920s, 1930s. Conservatorship laws, mental health laws, whatever the intent of the legislator throughout sort of the history of our countries, they are exploited for discriminatory practices. And I think that is the thing that runs throughout all of this is that when you empower people to have authority over other people, you can't then get lax on the oversight. You have to get into the details and monitor that authority if you're going to give it. And I think that's what happens again and again is when you're talking about disenfranchised, underserved people being exploited for these sort of a profit. It's sort of inevitable if you have the least powerful people and you give someone even more authority over them. You have to take responsibility for that. I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And here we have this long history where we know of the intertwining of psychology and psychiatry and these kinds of extraordinary powers in the development of colonialism in both America and Canada. That history is very clear. David Edward Walker's new book on that topic is really quite detailed, and I interviewed him in my book as well about the sort of closely intertwined history of colonialism with psychiatric power.
So in New York State, several years ago, the State Office of Mental Health released a revised interpretation of what criteria was necessary for an involuntary hospitalization. They expanded it. They expanded their interpretation of grave disability. Mayor Eric Adams, when elected, then just grabbed that and proposed this idea of expanding it to different licensed certified people. So a marriage counselor or just anyone licensed in any way relating to psychology could be a person who authorizes involuntary hospitalization, could do the evaluation. And so now, with this sort of series of events, there is a bill in the New York State Assembly which is going to officially change the mental hygiene law. I hate that they still call it the mental hygiene law, but the mental hygiene law to expand the types of professionals that can authorize an involuntary hospitalization to marriage counselors, various types of social workers. So they're expanding the professions that can be that final point of authorization.
Yeah, well beyond anyone that would quote unquote be in the medical profession now into all sorts of therapists. And then something else I noticed, Jesse, when I looked at that bill on page, I think it was 22 or so, it starts to lay this out. And it wasn't summarized in the text summary, the official text summary. It wasn't really being talked about in the news media stories about it, but they expand it even more broadly to all sorts of staff that operate adult care facilities in New York. So this could include group homes, assisted living, all sorts of other places where people are just staying long term. And now these people, instead of having to sort of consult with more, someone with some kind of other expertise or call in police to make an assessment, they themselves can effectively authorize the involuntary commitment under this bill. So I was quite shocked by that.
So there's already this ridiculously expansive list of people who can initiate the process. Now they're expanding the list of the people who can then take you to the next step. And the thing that I think is important to note about that, with the expansion of people who are the final point before you're actually in an involuntary hospitalization in a facility, by expanding it beyond physicians, you are essentially giving up on the concept that there are alternative explanations to the symptoms being presented. There are cases where people are involuntarily hospitalized and it turns out to be Lyme disease. It turns out to be an infection. It turns out to be a vitamin B deficiency. That is, in theory, why you need someone who has a broad medical expertise to go through a list to look for alternative explanations. They're essentially abandoning that responsibility and just trying to streamline it.
That is a very, very powerful and important point, Jesse. Thank you for making that. Regular listeners will know I've been writing quite often about 988, and we've talked about it together. You've reported on it separately on Committable as well. These helplines that exist out there and terrible things that can happen to people if unwittingly, against their will, their call may get traced. They may get involuntarily hospitalized, get police visits that themselves can be very dangerous even before these forced hospitalizations occur. And so I was particularly struck by the fact that a recent exposure of a story in United Kingdom where an addiction helpline was operating in such a way that they were actually taking kickbacks from treatment providers, and they not disclosed this in any way, shape, or form. So they were actually found guilty of this, as it were, under a law related to advertising. So they'd simply been found guilty of kind of misleading people around this. And they were taking kickbacks from treatment providers. And then when you called the helpline thinking that you were just having this opportunity to talk about your problem, they would slowly cajole, coerce, or otherwise kind of channel you towards this entity. Now, there was no indication in this case that they were forcing you to use this treatment provider, but obviously the potentiality is there. And it made me wonder a lot about, could anything like that be going on here in America or Canada with respect to 988 or indeed other helplines that exist out there?
Well, I think like so much has to go wrong before that can ever actually happen. Like someone has to believe that they're going to get away with it, or that it's appropriate. And that the other thing I would say is that in the U.S., with the recent reporting about how the federal government HHS might cut funding specifically for the LGBTQ section of 988. I think it's important to acknowledge that this sort of service is appropriate. It is necessary to have a place that people can call. There are a lot of questions about how these lines are operated, and they should be criticized and scrutinized. But if you only cut one demographic out of that service, if you specifically target a group of people that you don't want to have access to that, there's no explanation for it other than just a sort of animosity or a dis I don't know, a distaste. It's a dehumanization of a specific group of people, and it's just disgusting.
And, as you're speaking of that, Jesse, what also concerns me about that kind of a development, and I think that there's actually going to be across the board cuts coming to 988 generally. If you look at the recently leaked budget bill, it looks like that. So although if you've highlighted they're completely want to cut the LGBTQ line, but it also raises the question, are we going to now have people saying, well, gee, we want to keep our helpline operating, so what's wrong with accepting some funding from treatment providers in order to continue to
Right.
provide the service? Because we know currently there are treatment providers that already are operating within that big umbrella of 988. They're running in some states the actual 988 line in that area. And so they're already involved. And maybe they start going, well, if we just keep pumping money into this helpline, and then now they've got a really vigorous sort of multiple levels of conflict of interest going on.
So, Bridgewater State Hospital, the Disability Law Center, which is the protection and advocacy organization in Massachusetts, released a statement about Bridgewater State Hospital. A lot of the concerns they've flagged themselves. I know that they have people who actually go to Bridgewater State Hospital and go inside and investigate, and they've been doing it for years. They've been releasing statements for years talking about all of their concerns and the need for some sort of change in the way that Bridgewater is run, because the way it's set up is you have the Department of Mental Health. They are the ones who kind of are in charge of oversight for psychiatric facilities in Massachusetts. You have the Department of Corrections. Bridgewater State Hospital is sort of a psychiatric facility that is run by the Department of Corrections. The Department of Mental Health has its policies. The Department of Corrections has its policies. Bridgewater State Hospital is run by a vendor named WellPath, who has their own policies. And so you can have someone go through this bizarre game of telephone kind of where they're passed from one institution to the next to the next. And when you get to Bridgewater State Hospital, who knows what sort of access you're going to have to whatever medications you might have used or whatever treatment you might have used, whatever community you might have relied on. So Bridgewater State Hospital becomes this weird sort of Bermuda Triangle type place where it's hard to figure out where the oversight is and what's happening and why these things are allowed to continue. And there was a documentary in the 1960s about the violations and the abuses in Bridgewater State Hospital. They had footage of it. They had footage of it in the 60s. And yet, for whatever reason, the state of Massachusetts is reluctant to change the way they're doing things. And I don't understand it, but this is an instance where having a protection and advocacy organization that is actually sending people to be on the ground looking at that facility is a real benefit because they can at least concretely say, yes, this is what we're seeing.
Yeah, as you know, because you're from that area, Jesse, like when I first wrote a little bit about Bridgewater myself, just highlighting these stories that were coming out in the past year or two around how abusive the whole facility was. I was deluged with people saying, "Oh, Rob, you don't know the half of this story, right?" And that's it, like you going all the way back to the 1960s, and it was true. I didn't know that 'cause I'm not from the area, you know, but it just highlights for me that that's not unique, right? That we know this is going on around the country in facilities of these kinds, the sort of complex oversight or lack thereof that you just described there, multiple organizations handling multiple aspects of it, and ultimately there being no one with the desire to stand up and go, okay, we need real oversight, meaningful oversight of all of this. What does that look like? In fact, I think they like the fact that it's kind of chaotic. It's another way of everybody being able to kind of disclaim responsibility, and that's undoubtedly contributed to the continuation of those problems. And that's something we see throughout the mental health system, particularly with respect to involuntary commitment, really around the country and indeed around North America. These same problems exist. If you have a concern, if you have a problem, you can point to the problem, you can show video of the problem, you know, as these cases are doing with respect to Bridgewater, right? They've got documentation, the evidence is climbing and climbing and climbing. Well, but yeah, you know, gee, right, the answers you kind of get, yeah, no, we really care about this. There's something underneath that that is just so painful. It is so tragic. It is so brutal. And I think that even starts to get lost in all this, doesn't it? It's just what we're really talking about here, which is people being put through such extraordinary suffering and this sort of embodied organizational, institutional lack of regard or care.
Mhm.
A legislator in Missouri had heard questionable things about the 988 line there and decided to kind of test it herself to see. Really, she had heard that it was kind of an impersonal experience. And so she was contacted the line and went through a process where she realized that she was simply interacting with an artificial intelligence or a fake intelligence bot of some kind that was kind of asking her basic questions and sort of interacting with her. And so she kind of escalated the alleged seriousness, if you will, kind of trying to of her situation by ultimately getting to the point where she was very explicitly implying, suggesting that she was about to kind of take her own life. Her goal in this doing this was to prompt an actual person to start interacting with her. Instead, what happened was the AI bot somehow ended up triggering a police alert. We don't know if, in fact, there was ever a human involved at any point. She never got to speak to one. So the AI bot essentially triggered the police intervention, and police contacted her. And there was then, of course, the threat that she could have been taken by police to a psychiatric hospital had she not been then disclosed I'm a prominent Missouri legislator, politician, and I was basically testing the line. And then there's been kind of outrage about her actions. You know, I'm shocked by the fact that they're already using AI on the 988 system to actually trigger these kinds of police interventions. But, you know, in this case, there actually a suggestion that there might be a criminal investigation, Jesse.
So I think there are two things I would say to that. One is if they're going to criminally investigate her and possibly bring charges against her for what I would assume be a charge of fraud for falsifying evidence related to some sort of medical process. If they're going to do that with her, they should do that for every clinician who did not meet the requirement for involuntary hospitalization, but still had an ambulance send someone. Do it for every police officer who picks someone up off the street and has an ambulance bring them to a facility where they don't meet their criteria. The other thing I would say is that that practice raises a question which has been sort of plaguing this process for many, many decades, which is how do you reliably determine who actually needs to be put through this process? How do you reliably determine if someone is being honest with you? How do you reliably determine if someone is giving you information that you can check or whatever? And so the evolution of it seems to have completely skipped the scrutiny of that question and gone straight to offloading it to AI when trained career psychiatrists have not been able to reliably demonstrate that they can always determine who's telling the truth and who needs to be put through this process.
Exactly. And if we're going to charge anyone with fraud, shouldn't we be charging the 988 line with fraud, advertising it as anonymous and confidential?
Mhm.
They're not saying, hey, call us, you'll get to chat with an AI bot for a little while who might call police on you. Like that's not what they're advertising. So yeah, let's charge them with fraud for that. I was excited to see in the trade journal Psychiatric Times, a trade journal for psychiatrists, that a psychiatrist there and a sociologist had written a fairly somewhat critical story about the expansions of guardianships, conservatorships going on in California currently. There's been a whole variety of different legislative tools introduced there over the past couple of years that will allow it make it easier to put people into long-term guardianships and usually with the intent of forcibly treating them for quote unquote mental health reasons. And I was glad to simply see a couple of people criticizing that in a trade journal for psychiatrists, and in particular, acknowledging on the record, quote, that there is still no consensus on when involuntary treatment works, for whom it works, and why you might need it. I paraphrased the little last bit of that quote there, but essentially that they're admitting that there's really no evidence, Jesse, supporting involuntary treatment. So I was glad to see that there. What did you think of this piece?
I had a far more, I think, critical view of it. I don't know the psychiatrist involved. I'm somewhat aware of Alex Barnard, the sociologist, and he has a good basic understanding of the conservatorship and mental health laws in California. But he's also, like, he was interviewed by the New York Times for the involuntary hospitalization policies in New York City, and he was very sort of supportive of the idea that they could turn out well because there are mechanisms in these laws that, hey, who knows? Why don't we try it? Never tried it before. We need to collect more information. And within this sort of article in Psychiatric Times, they seem to be making the argument that too many people are focused on the words of the laws rather than the outcomes. And there's a debate that we keep having, and I'm so tired of having it. And that debate is like, well, we just don't have enough information about these laws. So why don't we just try a new one, which is based off of the same model, which wasn't based off of science? None of these mental health laws are based off of science. They are laws. They are laws that were created to target specific types of people for theoretically treatment in best case scenario, but really disappearing. And so when you look at sort of the history of these laws, they are laws, they're not science, and you argue we shouldn't be focused on the wording of the law. I get the impression you aren't the person that you don't think you're the person that's going to be targeted by this because when you're being detained and your only hope is to try to find a legal mechanism because it's a legal process. Your only hope is to find a legal mechanism to potentially avoid further trauma or just life-ending potentially repercussions. The wording of the law is your only hope for that. Don't dismiss it. And they also cite the idea in the end, they're concluding like thoughts. They cite the idea that, well, decades ago, we closed a bunch of state hospitals, and that's why we've led to this, I think they call it bottlenecking or something, of involuntary hospitalizations. This sort of perpetuated myth that all the state hospital closed and that's why everyone's on the streets. Like so many other things have happened with the rise in the prison industrial complex over the past 70, 80 years, whatever. So many other th factors have been involved in the moment that we're currently in. It is continually infuriating that people keep pointing to this deinstitutionalization narrative without any critical thought. And these are the people claiming that they're the scientists coming in to evaluate this, but they're scientists evaluating a legal process which wasn't based on science. So that was Those are my thoughts.
Right. Yeah. And there's something else about that that here and more generally, we see this infused with this notion of, hey, if our intentions are
Mhm.
good, then, we can kind of fudge everything else, right? And I think that's what anyone who gets subjected to this, right? Your intentions against my will. Right. Wait
Mhm.
a minute. Wait. No, I don't really care what your intention supposedly is. Let's back up to what you're highlighting here. No, some of these wordings are very important. Some of these processes are very important. And yeah, let's not fudge around with generalizations and, all of these sort of assurances that, well, despite the lack of evidence, like that, I guess that's now that you're highlighting it, that is profoundly disturbing that they said, despite the lack of, because of this lack of evidence, we should stop doing it. That was definitely not their message.
Right. And the final thing I'll say is that care courts were sort of presented as this new model, a new thing. We have to wait and see how this new thing operates before we can reach any conclusions. It's the same model that's been used for decades. How many decades of clearly demonstrated discriminatory practices, abuse, unnecessary trauma? How many decades of evidence of that do you need before you actually say, hey, maybe this model isn't working? There have also been a series of incidents throughout the world of psychiatric abuse.
Yeah, what strikes me about these, Jesse, is that it seems much easier for us to see quote unquote improper uses of involuntary commitment powers in other countries, especially if countries like China or Iran, who may be officially the public enemy or something, suddenly we can see it very clearly. So we saw a case, well, actually a collection of cases they were discussing in China where people were being detained in psychiatric hospitals for quote unquote being troublemakers. So this was an actual term in translated, of course, but this was the term that psychiatrists were using in China, a troublemaker. And then there was a case of a woman in Iran who was apparently protesting abusive uses of the laws that required her to dress a certain way. And in protest, she was seen walking down the street in only her undergarments. And what strikes me about that is these were covered as, when these people got detained and held and in some cases even involuntarily treated, that was clearly abusive. And yet we have very similar types of cases in North America where obviously if a person's running down the street naked, we should lock them up in a psychiatric hospital. How many times people even say this as if that's self-evident?
Mhm.
And of course, troublemaking is just as similar to disturbing the peace or these kind of other cases we've talked about around people doing things in the street that upset others. And suddenly now this is becomes a justification to lock them up in a psychiatric hospital or treat them against their will.
I would love someone to attempt to answer when looking at these sorts of abuses throughout the world, how much of that precedent, how much of that example is being set by what we do here in the United States with our history of using involuntary hospitalizations and commitment as a tool for oppressing political movements or oppressing and silencing whistleblowers. How much of the rest of the world is learning from the practices they see here?
And I think you highlighted that in another discussion we had, Jesse, around taking us back to the 1950s, 60s, the transition of, they used to lock up women, predominantly women, labeling them with schizophrenia and treating them against their will in that context. And then the use of the term schizophrenia transitioned in the 1950s and 60s with the rise of the civil rights movements in the United States. And suddenly they started applying it more predominantly to people of color, Black dissidents of different kinds who are protesting, labeling them as violent schizophrenics. And to some degree, that term has continued to today, that use of that law.
Well, yeah, it's specifically white women before like the 60s, and then now black men. And I believe that's true in places like the UK as well, and I think possibly Canada, that the schizophrenia specifically is being disproportionately given to black men. And so when you can see a shift like that, and it is in a moment like the civil rights movement. It is hard to look at that without asking serious questions about how that tool is being used for oppression.
Yeah, and it's just a bit of a mind flip for you to raise that issue of maybe these other countries have actually learned that from us.
So that is just a small selection of stories related to involuntary hospitalizations and psychiatric abuse throughout the world. There are constantly more stories happening. So take care of each other. If you see a story, elevate it, and hopefully we'll cover more in the future.
Yeah, and this might be a good moment to highlight that people can go to PsychForce.Report and see the entire article with even more stories than we talked about here. But in particular, there are a few nice ones that towards the end that I highlight that have good endings to them. And so maybe people can go there and enjoy those because gosh knows a lot of this is pretty dark.
Yeah.